Okay, so there are just a few key points that I'd like to convey to you today, and then I'll open for questions. First of all, Parkinson's disease is not that easy to diagnose. It can frequently be mistaken for a number of other conditions, ranging from just plain old essential tremors to a bunch of things that you probably haven't heard of. And if you haven't, that's a good thing, because they're actually more serious than Parkinson's, like progressive supranuclear palsy or corticobasal degeneration. The other thing is, Parkinson's is a movement disorder, but it's not just a movement disorder. There are a whole host of other problems that are what we call the non-motor symptoms that are important for your doctors to be able to identify and address to ensure your best possible quality of life despite the Parkinson's. The other thing is that you need a multidisciplinary team. You need a team of a primary care doctor, physical therapist, voice therapist, social worker, or home health agency, and preferably, if you can get it, a neurologist that work together and communicate to ensure the best possible care for you. A neurologist, particularly one who has extra training and experience in Parkinson's, is in a position to give a more accurate diagnosis earlier on and develop a treatment plan that allows you to have the best possible quality of life despite your Parkinson's. So first of all, starting out, there's a myth that I'd like to dispel. There are a lot of people, and I even had questions before I started today, who have been reading on the internet that delaying your medications, delaying treatment for Parkinson's as long as possible is important, or that it's a protective thing to prevent damage from the medication itself. How many of you have heard that before? A few of you. Okay. So that, people who still write that, or people who still tell that to their patients, people in my generation call them the dinosaurs. Okay? That is a myth that used to be taught back in the 90s. So there's some people who still haven't been reading studies out of the New England Journal or going to continuing education events that still tell their patients that. That is plain wrong. There have been studies conducted to show if people start their medications earlier, they actually have a better quality of life than people who wait. And that quality of life never quite catches up. Another analogy is like you're trying to save up money in a bank account, in a pension or retirement fund, thinking you're going to have more money to take out later, right? That works on the financial side, except when you find out that Bernie made off with all the money. That's what it's like trying to wait to take your levodopa for 5 or 10 years. That levodopa may not work as well 5 or 10 years from now, but it's because the Parkinson's is progressing. And so that's why we're heavily involved in research, not just at Banner Sun Health Research Institute, but working closely with the Mayo Clinic and with Barrow Neurological Institute to try to understand why the Parkinson's spreads throughout the nervous system and progresses and starts to cause more and more symptoms and require use of more medication over time. But we're also conducting studies designed to try to slow that progression. So I encourage you to keep an eye on the websites of these programs to see what are the studies that are up and coming where we're getting you involved as Parkinson's community and finding these answers. So starting with the first key point, diagnosing Parkinson's disease does not involve blood tests, does not involve a brain scan, although those things can be used sometimes as information to help us make the diagnosis. Does anyone know what's the only way to diagnose it for sure? Ryan, autopsy. That's not very useful to you. It is of no value to the patient because you can't take the brain out, put it under the microscope, put it back in, and have it work. I know you're hearing talk about head transplants, but that's still science fiction, okay? There are some possible ways that we can really improve our accuracy of the diagnosis earlier on. First of all, we don't just schedule 15 minutes for the new patient visit. We schedule an hour to get the whole story. Because we need to talk to you about all the medications that you've been taking, because some of them can cause symptoms that look like Parkinson's. We need to talk about not just what are the problems you're seeing with tremor or slow movements, but other non-motor problems that we often see with Parkinson's disease. And we need to do a full exam where we look at the movement. We can't just watch you walk down the hall and tell you have Parkinson's, because why? Because you're not dead yet. We can't tell for sure that you have Parkinson's until we've followed you over time. We see that you don't have any red flags, that you have other symptoms that point in a different direction, and we see that you respond to medications that we ultimately will start prescribing. We don't push the medications on you just to make a diagnosis, but to improve your quality of life. Once we've followed you for a long time, we can really improve our confidence in the diagnosis. But it's never 100%. One of the ways that we're trying to address that as a research community down in the Phoenix Valley is trying to find ways to look at little bits of tissue from the body that we can take safely without causing a lot of pain or injury that'll show the same changes that we see in the brain. So one area that's showing a lot of promise is the salivary glands. The reason is the Parkinson's Lewy bodies, these proteins that clump up in the brain and cause damage, are seen early on in the salivary glands, in your esophagus, and the lining of your stomach. The only place that we can safely take a little piece of is from the salivary gland, just taking it from under the chin here. You don't want us going in your esophagus, trust me. That would not be fun. We are in the process of recruiting more people to help us conduct that research through the Mayo Clinic. Mayo Clinic has a really important study. Can't emphasize how important this is. They're studying not just salivary gland, but other parts like skin, even colon. Colon is something we all get biopsied when we get our colonoscopy. I have to do my first one soon. I'll get biopsied. So, these are 3 areas of the body that all could improve our ability to diagnose Parkinson's more accurately early on. The reason that's important is, first of all, we don't give you unnecessary treatments if it's not Parkinson's. But second of all, imagine all these years we've been enrolling people in studies of medication for Parkinson's, and probably 1 in 10, maybe even 2 out of 10 people enrolled in those studies don't really have Parkinson's. So those studies that said the treatment didn't work might have failed because there were too many people in the study with the wrong diagnosis. So that's where we need better, more accurate ways to diagnose Parkinson's. That said, seeing a neurologist is the first step to getting a more accurate diagnosis. And a good neurologist knows when to refer. So when I see a really tough patient with epilepsy, I refer to an epilepsy specialist. If I diagnose Lou Gehrig's, which is a nerve muscle disease, I refer to a center of excellence for ALS. So a good neurologist who sees a patient where they're not sure if it's Parkinson's or not won't say, try this, I'll see you in 6 months. They'll refer you to a specialist. And we have at least 5 clinics in the Phoenix Valley with neurologists who have specialty training in Parkinson's disease and other movement disorders. That means after the 4 years of neurology residency, most of them have done an extra 2 years of training. And for most of us, about 60% of our practice or more is Parkinson's. In Sun City, that's probably a little higher. Why is that? As we get older, the risk of all these degenerative conditions of the brain goes up. So the risk of Parkinson's after age 65 starts to approach 2%. So 2 out of every 100 people over the age of 65 is probably going to have Parkinson's or something like it. The risk of Alzheimer's also goes up. And the risk of Alzheimer's is actually higher in women. The risk of Parkinson's is higher in men, but it can affect either gender. The other point I wanted to make to you today is that we do have treatments that can improve quality of life by addressing the motor symptoms. So this is tremor is one of them, but another important problem is that you're losing cells that produce dopamine, and because of that, that dopamine that's necessary to control repetitive voluntary movements isn't enough anymore, and so you have to concentrate to swing your arms when you walk. Otherwise, that arm kind of pulls in, or that leg doesn't swing. You have to really concentrate on big letters when you write, or the writing just gets smaller and smaller. Eventually, it gets hard to do repetitive things or fine motor skills like buttoning or cutting food. Even rolling over in bed becomes difficult. And people say, well, that's okay. It's just my right hand. I'll just start writing with my left hand. I'm adapting. But little by little, you start giving up all these activities because you're adapting to the motor symptoms, when just taking medications that activate the dopamine system could get you back closer to where you were before. Could get your golf score back to where it was even. And that's, I think, probably for a lot of people, a more convincing reason to start medication than just to improve their handwriting. The other thing is, even though levodopa, this carbidopa-levodopa, we call Sinemet, is the most effective treatment we have, it can cause side effects over time. The side effects, I think if you've seen Michael J. Fox, is a great example of what those can be when you've had Parkinson's a long time. His medication wears off frequently, and when he wears off, he's slow and he has tremor. But when his medication is working, it causes other involuntary wiggly, twitchy movements called dyskinesia. That's not a reason not to take the medication, but particularly for younger patients where this is going to be a lifelong problem and actually more likely to happen with a young onset patient, we may use medications for a short period of time to try to delay using that levodopa. Those medications often include medications in the family of drugs called dopamine agonists. Any of these sound familiar? Nupro, pramipexole, ropinirole, Mirapex, Requip. These are medications that are much more likely to cause side effects as we push the dose to an effective amount. These side effects are more common in older patients. Older meaning over 65. These side effects can include seeing things that aren't there, paranoid delusions, impulse control disorders, like compulsive gambling, or hypersexuality, which is more common in men, compulsive shopping and binge eating, more common in women, although I've seen it in all genders. These are the most devastating side effects, but nausea and dizziness and swelling in the legs are also more common. So it's really important, if you've got those side effects and your doctor is just giving you the dopamine agonist, you're not getting any carbidopa-levodopa, you have to bring that up with your doctor. They don't always think to mention that side effect, even though it's a well-known side effect. The other thing is, we may use the combination of a lower dose of some of those medications, like the dopamine agonist, so that allows us to use a little less levodopa, to try to delay those side effects. So it does make sense in Parkinson's disease to combine more than one medication. It's not that we're pill pushers. We really try to be conservative and use the minimum dose necessary, but using multiple medications in combination may actually make sense because it can reduce side effects by lowering the dose. The other important point is, this is not just a movement disorder. If you have Parkinson's disease, you've been diagnosed, your doctor should be asking you about a number of other non-motor problems. These include problems with thinking, memory, attention, slower processing speed, cognitive difficulties, balance problems and falls that don't respond to medication but to physical therapy. Psychiatric problems, being more prone to anxiety or depression, because it's not just dopamine that's low, but serotonin is low also. Seeing things that aren't there, which can happen even without the medication, but is more common as you start medication. fragmented sleep where you wake more frequently or you develop restless legs in the night as your medication wears off. Acting out your dreams where you might shout or hit or kick in a way that reflects what you're dreaming about. Constipation, which becomes worse as you adjust the dose of the medication. Bladder urgency, which gets worse over time. All of these non-motor problems that I just mentioned have a treatment. They all have medications that can be helpful. Another important problem that is more common as we get older is we get a little lightheaded when we stand up. We call that orthostatic hypotension, drop in blood pressure with standing. But in Parkinson's disease, the Lewy bodies aren't just in the motor circuit of the brain, but in the autonomic nervous system that regulates your blood pressure. So your blood pressure may be too high lying down, but too low when you stand up. So you may get dizzy, even faint and fall. It can be very debilitating. So it's important that your doctors, if you're getting lightheaded or even falling from that they don't just measure your blood pressure sitting down, but standing up and think about this problem. And they shouldn't be raising the dose of the daytime blood pressure medications if you're having low blood pressure standing up. They should be thinking about this orthostatic hypotension, and if they're not comfortable treating it, refer to a neurologist or even cardiologist who is. Every one of these non-motor symptoms has a treatment, but you can't treat it unless you know about it and you ask about it. So if you're seeing a doctor who is not asking these questions, you have to bring it up with them, but also encourage referral to a neurologist who's experienced with Parkinson's. So it is a complicated condition to diagnose and to manage. One of the biggest challenges for me as a doctor is that every healthcare system throughout the state, wherever I practice, has a different record system. Some of them even have paper charts. Some doctors don't answer the phone except from 9 to 4 and not on lunch break. And they don't answer when they're with the patient. So it's very hard to get your doctors to communicate with one another, to copy each other on their notes. So identifying doctors who are willing to communicate with your other doctors, that's a really important step you can take to be proactive as a patient or care partner. Really encourage your primary care doctor and your neurologist to communicate and encourage them to work with a physical therapist at least once to get you an exercise program, not just to improve balance, but ensure that you can continue to be physically active and have an exercise plan that doesn't just improve your conditioning or the way you look, but actually helps you work on being more focused on bigger movements. Working with a speech therapist that helps you be more focused on projecting when you speak. So physical therapy and voice therapy are an important component of the treatment that complements what we're doing with medication. Now, one of the important questions I had earlier today, a sport group leader here, was what about supplements and what about natural approaches? So first of all, it is important to have a healthy diet and not to get dehydrated in the summer. Wear a hat when you're going to be in the sun, especially those of us who don't have as much hair as we did 20 years or 40 years ago. Make sure you're not completely cutting salt out of the diet if you're playing golf and you're sweating a lot. You do need to replenish those electrolytes. Increase fiber in the diet to address constipation, but do understand you may need to add a stimulant laxative to control that constipation if the dietary measures don't help. But when talking about a natural approach, one of the questions that comes up is, well, can't I get natural levodopa from my diet, from fava beans, perhaps? Can I take it as a supplement, this bean extract, mucuna? You can, but you have to do it with a little bit of caution, and you have to let your doctor know this is what you're planning to do. I personally don't usually encourage it, but if it's working well for a patient, I continue to work with what's going okay for them. The challenge in trying to use a supplement or beans as a source of levodopa is FDA requires that if we say there's 100 milligrams of levodopa in that tablet, it's going to be within 5% of that. If it's a supplement, the FDA does not require that quality control. And the amount of levodopa in fava beans is going to vary depending on the crop. The other challenge is if you're ever in the hospital, the doctors aren't necessarily going to realize you're getting your levodopa from your garden or from a supplement, and they may mistakenly discontinue that levodopa, which can cause a life-threatening withdrawal reaction called neuroleptic malignant syndrome. So that's a kind of a big challenge when people take the natural approach. I've had some people do that, but it does not protect against those levodopa side effects. I've met people who have been taking mucuna as their levodopa source for years, and they have the same dyskinesia Michael J. Fox does. So it does not protect against levodopa side effects taking a natural source of levodopa. It just makes your treatment more complicated. And it puts you at risk of being taken off the medication inadvertently in the hospital. So just cautionary note there. The other thing is, what about supplements that are purported to treat Parkinson's or to reverse the course or slow the progression? Well, the only supplements that have been well studied in large studies comparing to a placebo with enough people enrolled to answer that question are coenzyme Q10 and creatine monohydrate. Anyone know the outcome of those studies? The studies were stopped early because halfway through the statisticians saw it was futile to continue. It was a waste of everyone's time and effort to continue because there was no way it was going to show an effect. So when somebody markets their product saying that it slows progression of Parkinson's, they have secondary gain there. They're going to make money if you buy the product, but none of those products are proven at this time. And to do the study the right way is too expensive for a supplement company to conduct. Only the big drug companies really have the funding to do those big studies, or the federal government. Both of those supplement studies were done through funding from National Institutes of Health. So I would just urge some caution with that. If you're spending hundreds of dollars a year or thousands of dollars a year on supplements, you might want to spend it on being physically active, more golf games, or spending more time traveling the world, or spending it on gifts for family. But that's your call. These are just supplements that are not proven. And the other thing is, when stem cell centers tell you that this is proven to reverse the course of or cure Parkinson's, there is no study that's proven that. There's not even proof that injecting those stem cells in the blood or in the spinal fluid actually gets them to where they might be needed, deep in the brain. They're happy to take your 20,000 plus, and some of them charge more than that. And the other thing is, they're not monitoring you for safety the way they would in a clinical trial. So for stem cell therapy, this should only be done through a research study, if you're doing it specifically for Parkinson's, where they're actually monitoring for safety, and they're upfront about the fact that this is still experimental. So bottom line, Parkinson's is something that if we really take a comprehensive approach, we have a team that communicates, we treat you not just for the motor symptoms, but the non-motor. We don't just take you off your medications if you start hallucinating, we treat the hallucinations so you can still take your levodopa. If we have a team approach with an experienced neurologist, you can live with Parkinson's, and in the vast majority of cases, people do not get to, in my experience, and at least in my movement disorder clinic, people do not get to an end stage of Parkinson's. They live with Parkinson's, they die with Parkinson's, usually from natural causes, something else, some other medical cause. You can live with Parkinson's with a good quality of life for many, many years if you get the right treatment. So those are all my key points.